Hey guys, this is Matt Gurney. This is your latest episode of On the Line, another dual guest episode. Two of them today because, frankly, there's too much news happening and we couldn't find one person who could do literally all of it. Your first guest here on this show, PJ Fournier of 338 Canada. He comes back. He was one of our original guests here on this new podcast. He gives us an update on what the hell has been happening in Canadian polling for the last 6 weeks. And oh my God, it has been a lot. After him, friend and colleague Stephen Marr, longtime journalist, author recently of a book on Justin Trudeau, on the legacy of Justin Trudeau. What's the good? What's the bad? What's the worst case scenario? What will some future historian 50 years ago, if they decide to write a retrospective on the Trudeau years, what will they say he got right? All that and more coming up in moments. This is On the Line.
This message is brought to you by the Forest Products Association of Canada. Canadian forestry supports 200,000 workers, generates $87 billion in annual revenue, and provides the products we need to build homes and drive economic growth. While trade barriers from the U.S. threaten jobs and investment, Canada's own approval processes and regulations are blocking critical projects that increase our self-reliance. We can and should have programs that expand domestic wood use, advance biomass and pulp market opportunities, and cut red tape and regulatory barriers. The Government of Canada has a clear opportunity to stand up for Canadian forestry at a time of growing global uncertainty. We need real action that puts Canadians first, supporting employees and their families, securing stability for our businesses, and protecting the long-term potential of our sector and its people. To learn more, visit ForestryForTheFuture.ca.
Well, it's great to have PJ Fournier back from 338canada.com. That's his polling analysis website. Also, newsletter. Check it out, 338canada.ca. PJ, you were here with me. Good morning. Yeah. What a fun day. St. Patrick's Day. Yay.
There you go.
So I'm guessing it was probably about 6 weeks ago that you were here with me last. And one of the things we talked about at the time, and thank God you're a smart, cautious guy, because one of the things you said 6 weeks ago was that something might be happening.
Yeah.
We don't know yet. And we don't have enough evidence to talk about what seems to be a pretty extraordinary change in the polling environment in Canada. So let me just put the question to you. Over the last 6 weeks, what has happened to the polling environment in Canada?
Wow. Okay, so there's been a major shift in voting intentions, but also in the leader approvals and the mood of the country. And again, we spoke six weeks ago. There was early signs of something that could happen. But the thing is, nothing is set in stone. When we see a fluctuation, either way, it can just revert back or it can amplify. And boy, did this one amplify. So polls from basically all the major polling firms in this country to varying amplitudes are seeing the Liberals rising. Some polls have the Liberals tied with the Conservatives, some have it a bit ahead, and some have it a little behind, which is entirely normal in the polling environment. But in the aggregate, the Conservatives had a 25-point lead, and they've blown it in 2 months. And I've been following polls daily, provincial, federal. I have never seen something like this before. So it is without precedent. It doesn't mean that it will last, but could it last for a 5-week campaign? Yeah, it could. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting, Barry, because you track polls. I track polls, not as closely as you do. We talked about this 6 weeks ago. I also track anecdotes. And I'm looking to see, is what I'm seeing, feeling, hearing out there aligning with what the polling picture is telling me? And 6 weeks ago, it wasn't. It's starting to, though. And what I've been starting to see is people who 2 or 3 months ago were so angry at Justin Trudeau, I'll never vote Liberal again. It's conservative all the way. They're taking a look at Carney. And I think what you said, I thought it was bang on, was this might not last. And I've been saying this for a while. I was talking to some conservative friends of mine just this weekend where I said, Right now, Carney's at his best possible issues environment. He's had maximum public view, zero controversial decisions yet, right? He hasn't had to piss anybody off. It's probably a sugar high, but they know that too.
Yeah.
And if they pull the plug on an election, can they ride this out long enough? Yeah, they could.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. They could. They could. And especially, I think it's not only about Carney and Trump. There's a lot of the landscape right now is about the arrival of Mr. Carney. I think we saw polls that gave Mr. Carney basically attributed a 3 to 5 point bump for Mr. Carney, which is good. But that doesn't explain how the Liberals close a 25-point gap. The conservatives appear to be lost right now. And I'm careful not to do editorials. I'm just looking at the numbers. I look at the trends, but we see everywhere in the country, BC, Atlantic Canada, Ontario, places where traditionally the Liberals do well. The Conservatives were way ahead. I mean, you remember my projection around Christmas time. I had the Liberals below the Bloc Québécois. Yves-François Blanchet was getting ready to be the official opposition leader, right? And right now, the latest update that I published on 338, both parties are tied, but their trend lines are diametrically opposed. And I'm not sure how long this will last, but I think the Conservatives are not helping their case right now.
I think the Conservatives are still acting like it was 3 months ago, and they're projected to win 250 seats. And
yeah, well, yeah. You leave, you're a Leafs fan, right? You've seen the Leafs take a 5-0 lead and suddenly it's 5-3. Do you play the same way, or do you just do you carry on, or do you adjust your strategy?
Well, if you're the Leafs, you just play the same way and carry on.
Well, bad analogy, yeah.
No, I think you're right. And I wonder, and this is not a polling question, this is a psychology question. So you're a polling expert and an astrophysicist. I'll do an update with you again in a few weeks, and I'm going to need you to be an expert in human psychiatry by then. So you're going to have some night school to do.
All right.
But one of the things I'm wondering is, if you're Pierre Poilievre and you're his close circle of advisors, you've had an amazing 3 years. You have purged Aaron O'Toole. You have established control over the Conservative Party. You have defeated the government on your key signature issue, the carbon tax. The Liberals have now retreated from that. You have driven Justin Trudeau from office. Psychologically, it might be hard for these guys to stop doing what has been working for them so far.
There's a saying in French, I'm not sure if it exists in English, but when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Does that exist too?
Almost verbatim.
Okay, so they have to find a way that the next campaign will not be about Justin Trudeau. It will not be about the carbon tax. It will be, of course, linked to affordability, which I think the Conservatives have campaigned on very intensely and pretty well as well in the past few months. But it looks like this campaign is going to be Poilievre attacking Carney and Carney attacking Trump. And so if in the minds of Canadians, when we look at the polling data that we see that dealing with the American anticipation is right up there with cost of living and healthcare. So they have to adjust their strategy. And I see right now the Conservatives throwing everything they can at Carney, but it's really hard to chase a ghost. Carney doesn't have a record yet. If you talk about the fact that he's an elitist and he's a banker, well, you also talked for 10 years that the Liberals had elected a drama teacher. So at some point, your message has to resonate with what people are thinking. There in your circle, I'm pretty sure that you've heard this, because I know I've heard it in my a little passive focus group, that perhaps we need a banker right now. Perhaps we need somebody very stoic, very calm, that knows the economy. And do the Conservatives have an answer for that? Who would be the economic expert on the Conservatives that can face off with Mr. Carney? I'm not sure who that is.
Build the homes. Stop the crime. Axe the tax. That's their answer.
Yeah.
How are you going to handle Donald Trump? We're going to build the homes. Who will be your point man in Washington? We're going to unleash powerful paychecks. how what are we going to do to diversify our economy and deepen our alliance with Europe and other members of the Western Democratic Bloc?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to bring it home.
Yeah.
And I get it. It's worked for 3 years, but it's not working now.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question about a little bit about. I think like you and I have just had harsh words there for the Conservatives. I do though want to sound a note of caution for the Liberals. If they are on a sugar high right now, and if they go to an election, and the rumors I'm hearing is telling me we're going to have an election pretty soon.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, you're putting a basically untested leader
Yep.
who has been carefully shielded from the media out there
Yep.
into the spotlight of a national campaign in the most turbulent period of history that I have ever lived through.
Yeah.
There's some downside risk to doing that.
Absolutely. There's no doubt. But when you're trailing, again, a hockey analogy, if you will allow me, but you're trailing 5-3 at the end of the third period, you pull your goalie. This
Yeah, you
is
do.
pulling your goalie.
Yep.
Because if you have Mr. Carney try to open parliament next week and try to govern, he may screw up. The mood of the country may change.
Mhm.
And also, you could give an opportunity to the NDP to recover. And you don't want that. The NDP is in a perfect spot for the Liberals right now. I have them right now at 15 seats. And I think I'm being generous. There are some seats in there that are close calls. My range for the NDP right now is from 6 to 18, and it takes 12 to be an official party at the House of Commons. So you don't want to give the NDP a chance to recover if you're the Liberals, right?
I was going to ask you about the NDP. I want to ask you in a very big picture sense, not even looking at polls, but looking at demographics. Which voters are moving? Like when we look at all these numbers here, like is this young voters going conservative to liberal? Is this women coming home to liberals? Where have the NDP voters gone? Like what demos are actually on the move right now?
Well, that's interesting because there's no clear answer. If you look not at a single poll, but at the aggregate, right? I'm pulling my numbers here. So January 12, the aggregate was 45 conservative, 21 liberal. That's amazing. 18 NDP. Okay. And you fast forward 2 months, the conservatives have lost 7 points. The NDP has lost 6, and the liberals have taken them all. This is also a dimension in Quebec. The Bloc Québécois, I don't know if you saw the numbers in Quebec, but the Bloc Québécois has also taken a hit. In the aggregate, the BQ has lost 12 points in the past 2 months. Basically, Mr. Carney and the Liberals right now are pulling in from pretty much everybody.
The reason I think that the Liberals are at a bit of an artificial sugar high right now, and again, granting, as you and I both said, that might be enough. If it lasts 5 or 6 weeks, that might be all they need.
Yep.
But I mentioned this to you before, I'm trying to align what the polls are telling me with what my brain, my five senses are telling me. I don't think Justin Trudeau was that unpopular. I think he was pretty unpopular, but I don't think he was like a 15-point drag on the party. I'm trying to figure out what combination of what we've looked at in the last 6 weeks is a combination of unpopular leader leaving, opening up some room for the Liberals to come back up, combined with what you and I were talking about a minute ago, which is I don't think the Conservatives know how to handle this moment.
Yeah. It's just I thought it was pretty unpopular, man. The personal numbers we look at approval numbers, favorable numbers. The questions differ, but the numbers were always like -40, -35, -30, whereas Mr. Poilievre is in the low negatives consistently. So you remove, and I don't want to make a bad analogy here, but it's like you remove sickness from a body, and then the body can recover. So it can be pretty beaten up, but it can recover. So I'm not sure what the number is, but when Justin Trudeau announced that he would resign on January 6th, all the way to January 9th, the Liberals gained maybe 4 or 5 points. It's really what's happening in the United States and how the Canadian political class has responded to that. I know the number. I know Mr. Poilievre is in a tough spot here, but he hasn't really attacked or responded to Mr. Trump in a very forceful way. I saw his tweet, I did, but At some point, you need a little more. And I do not know what their internal numbers are saying. They have to have a strategy behind this. I'm not sure. But this renewed wave of patriotism that is caused from an attack from the outside, you would think the Conservatives would be able to benefit from that. I mean, Canadian identity is not attached to the Liberals or the Conservatives. It's usually nonpartisan. How come the Liberals are the only one benefiting from this? It goes at the feet of the Conservatives a little bit, at least.
I agree. Yeah, no, and you said a minute ago, they have to have a plan. Oh, do they?
Well, they had a plan.
They had a plan.
Yes.
I think that's exactly it. They had a plan. And I think maybe it's emotional sunk costs, right? Maybe they've spent so much time falling in love with their own plan that they don't want to go out and come up with a new one. And they are modifying the plan. Like they've taken the cost of living, axed the tax plan, and they've added some Canada First stuff around it. Yep. And, we will never be the 51st state. But I think what they're trying to do is save the campaign plan they had by just adding a couple of extra little spices and seasonings to it. And I don't think they've realized yet that they need a new recipe. They've got to dump that pot and just start from scratch. And you know what? The funny thing is, this is just my gut feeling. I don't have any polls to back this up. I'll let you go after this because I know we're both running the clock today. But I think if the Conservatives are equally as good on Trump and Canadian identity as the Liberals, if they just negate that advantage, I think they're going to win. Because I think then they win on frustration, cost of living.
Yep.
But if the Liberals continue to have an advantage over the main issue, I don't think the Conservatives can be good enough on cost of living to win that campaign.
The movement from the NDP to the Liberals, as I said, is not the only movement we've seen, but it's still significant. These are voters that anecdotally, and according to what we're seeing in the numbers, that say, Trump, I don't want this here. And Monsieur Poilievre, although he's not Trump, but the Trump lovers in Canada are with Poilievre. What does that tell you? That's why Monsieur Poilievre has to walk a fine line. Associating Monsieur Trump with Monsieur Poilievre is unfair, but if it works, the Liberals will do it. I mean, the Conservatives also had pretty hard hitting attack ads on Liberals. So I guess maybe they were not ready for the Liberals to push back. We'll see in a campaign, but the Conservatives have the highest floor of any party. They have history on their side. Usually after a decade in power, we throw the bombs out and we change them. That's how it works. It's natural term limits. So all these precedents are on the side of the Conservatives, which I think if they do blow this, will hurt even more because they should win right now. Even if they don't win 230 seats, all they need is 172. If they win 175, perhaps they'll look at their map and say, well, that's not that good, but they will have a majority and they'll be there for 4 years. But right now, I have them losing in Quebec, losing Atlantic Canada, not doing well enough in Ontario, and slipping in BC. That's not a recipe for a victory.
Imagine they win 171.
Then you go to Monsieur Blanchet and you say, what do you want, Yves-François? Do you want something?
No, first you go to a bar. Then you go to the block leader. Yeah. All right. PJ, thanks again, buddy. Appreciate the update. We'll check in with you, especially as a campaign nears. But in the meantime, check him out, 338.com for the website, and of course, 338.ca for the newsletter. Thanks, man. Have a great St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, Matt. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you.
This message is brought to you by the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's Sault Ste. Marie in the early 1800s. Winter is fading and the forests are waking up. In the crisp morning air, a Métis family moves through the sugar bush, wooden taps in hand. They press them into the towering maple trees, watching as the first drops of clear sap begin to trickle into birch bark baskets. For generations, the Métis in Sault Ste. Marie have harvested maple sugar using knowledge passed down from their ancestors. In spring, they gather in the sugar bush, boiling the sap over open fires until it thickens into syrup. By canoe and by cart, Métis traders carry the sweet harvest to the British and French fur posts, where sugar is as valuable as pelts. It sweetens tea in Montreal, flavors bread in York, and sustains voyageurs paddling through Ontario's vast waterways out onto the prairies. Through resilience and skill, the Métis turned maple sugar into an industry that fueled the fur trade, connected communities, and built a legacy that endures to this day. To learn more, go to OntarioMétisFacts.com.
Well, joining me from Nova Scotia, where he was just explaining to me he's recuperating because apparently he is like me, a fellow broken ankle veteran, longtime journalist and author, most recently of The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau. Stephen Maher is here. The most important question is, how are you feeling?
Well, I'll be all right. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. Recording this on the Monday, and I've got I don't know if it shows up on camera, but I am wearing green. So I'm honoring my grandfather's heritage on that one. So I'm going to tell you nothing that's a state secret or anything, but this actually wasn't the episode I was planning on doing today. I was really locked in on the idea of talking about why the conservative numbers are tanking. But a buddy of mine said to me, you got to do Trudeau's legacy and you got to do it for the next episode. And I was like, why? And he said, because Donald Trump is going to tweet 9,000 insane things between your two episodes. And if you don't talk about Trudeau this week, you maybe never will. And I thought about that and I realized he was right. Even after a decade of Trudeau being prime minister, if we don't get it out of the way, the news cycle might just overtake us. So let me ask you a big picture question as a guy who's spent some time trying to get an understanding of Justin Trudeau. Big picture question, it's a little bit of an Oprah one. How did you feel last week when you were watching the transition, when you saw that picture of him wiping away tears with the governor general? I don't necessarily mean kind of like what your emotions were, but what was going through your head? What were you thinking last week on Friday?
Well, at one level, at last, my book came out in May, and at that time, I thought, well, the guy has got to go, right? It had been clear to me for some time that his moment had come and gone, and everyone but him seemed to recognize that. And it further appeared to me that the longer he stayed, the worse he looked. And so I saw him, that picture, the picture of him crying as he saw Mary Simon. And I thought a couple of things about that. One, it's always drama with this guy, right? That's his nature. Secondly, he, for whatever reason, seems to have had a case of l'état c'est moi, that he had come to feel himself inseparable from the country. And he seemed to be having a very hard time letting go. And I think because of his sort of obvious strength, or I don't know if strength's the word, commitment to the country that was sort of evident in the last couple of weeks under the Trump bullying, I could feel some human sympathy for him in a way that I probably was struggling to a couple of weeks earlier.
You and I have been in different formats writing about Trudeau for almost a decade. And you went full book length. I'm not sure I would have had the emotional strength, but in different forums, we've been watching this guy and writing about this guy. And I'll be honest with you, I never found it hard to have human sympathy for the guy. And I think that's been especially true over the last 18 months. The 2 summers ago, the announcement about the end of his marriage, almost precisely coinciding with a massive polling collapse. You couldn't help but kind of go, oh man, what are you doing? Like, and I think, as you said a minute ago, there was that sense of finally when he left. Finally doesn't necessarily mean I was exasperated with him, although sometimes I was. Finally also meant sort of like, thank God it's over for him. Like, he can now go, he's still a young guy. He can go build a whole new life. And he's got 3 beautiful kids who are probably going to be glad to have their dad back. But I also think mixed in with that has been my frustration for the last year and a half, but also intensely for the last 8 weeks, that what was right for Justin Trudeau and what was right for the Liberal Party probably wasn't what was right for Canada. Like, we sat around waiting for 8 weeks to do anything here, and I don't know how future historians are going to judge that.
Yeah, I wrote a piece for the Star a couple months ago saying the verdict of history is going to be harsh if this guy doesn't get the message soon. And he didn't until Chrystia Freeland stuck the knife in him. And I've come to realize since then, partly from doing some reporting for an afterword for the paperback version of my book, that he really had come to see himself as inseparable from the country and believed that anyone else would not do as good a job, would not be able to beat Poilievre, could not look after the national interest. And it sort of, when that sank in, I was like, okay, well, it sort of makes sense then why he would, keep sticking around. One thing I would point out is that you say that you've never found it difficult to feel sort of human feelings of sympathy for him. I would say that might be because you haven't tried to write a book about him. I started out being generally sympathetic to him, but yet this feeling of exasperation, I think, is normal. That he wouldn't go when it was obvious to everyone that he should.
My mother used to tell me that after spending all day cooking a meal, at the end of the day, she couldn't bear to eat it. She was just tired of looking at it, and maybe writing a book about someone results in a kind of a similar attitude of, I never want to look at this again. I never want to think about this again. Let's talk for a minute, though, about the idea of him considering himself to be inseparable from the state. Do you think that was, in your assessment, was that a policy position? Was it ego, or was it almost emotional sunk costs? Like, just going, I've sacrificed so much for this. How can I leave now with so much unfinished?
There's a funny video that I wrote about in the book where I'm trying to remember now if it was 2011, 2012, where before he was leader of the Liberals, he did a scrum in the House of Commons that the Liberal Party staff told him would be unwise to respond to a Conservative attack on him. And he's still got the soul patch and long hair, and he's speaking about himself in the third person in a kind of exaggerated way, and says, the question is not just Justin Trudeau love his country, because everyone knows he does. Justin Trudeau feels the country in his bones with every breath he takes. So, and the reporters were all standing around trying to, not laugh at this extremely dramatic performance. But in thinking about it over the years, though, I thought, well, that's how he feels. He feels from that time, from maybe his whole life, that he has a unique connection to the country. And it's something that John Kay pointed out when he was working ghosting his memoirs. They went to some event, and some kid it was the Algonquin College in Ottawa, said, well, what are your favorite Canadian bands? And he could say, oh, well, I really like this new band from BC right now, and of course he could just spiel off at length about the culture of pop music across Canada. He's been everywhere. He knows the history. Like, there, in a sense, he didn't have academic qualifications, but I think he really had a sense of the country and a sense of responsibility to it.
So I don't want to say that you and I are old, because I think we're both very much in our prime. But we've had the opportunity personally within living memory, but also professionally within our working lives, to now observe a series of prime ministers. And one of the truths of political writing is that as a prime minister gets further away from time in office, normally there's a softening of reputation and feelings. And every time I've tried to write or talk about Justin Trudeau's legacy these last few weeks, I've made a point of mentioning that. Like, I want to go out of my way because right now people are caught up in emotions. They love the guy, they're sorry to see him go. They hate the guy, they never want to think about him again. That will change. What do you think when we are in a more cooler heads prevailing era? What do you think the Canadian public is going to remember about this guy? And I know it's a big question, and I'm not gonna hold you to it because we're just spitballing here. But if you were to try and guess what his legacy is going to be for the version of you or some other person who writes the next book about Justin Trudeau, what's chapter one?
Well, so I've been thinking about this a lot. A book like mine is, you might consider, a second draft of history, and there will be university professors who later write the third draft of history. And so, it's in a sense, it's not for us. There was a poll last week that said Canadians thought that legalizing marijuana was his most important legacy. I'm not sure that's right. I mean, it was significant, and everyone knows that he did it. I think so. When I started writing or doing interviews for the book, I was started to wrestle with this question. I would bounce it off people, and at that time, I had been thinking that his prime ministership was likely to be more consequential, more transformative than that of Harper or Chrétien, who were seen as sort of managerial guys who didn't really change the country that much, and that he might be best compared with Mulroney for having brought in some fairly significant changes. And I remember talking to some old Chrétien people at that time, and they would say, "Are you serious? Like, our government was much better." And then they would make a vigorous counter argument. And now I'm kind of thinking that the most apt comparison in a way might be with Harper, in that an awful lot of what both of them did were things having to do with the size and function of the government. So Harper cut taxes, restrained the growth of government. Trudeau massively expanded entitlements. And so to judge either of them, the first thing that you're going to do is ask yourself whether, sort of, how you feel in general about the government expanding or contracting. And the other thing is that both of them, a lot of what they did was significant for partisan reasons. 3 governments, in both cases, 1 majority, 2 minorities. In both cases, the country ended up being divided around the question of resource extraction and climate. I would say it's not hard to argue that Harper left the country in better shape than Trudeau. Although I think also that the circumstances that Trudeau faced, with a pandemic, twice the election of Trump, really were very difficult. And he deserves, probably, history will say, he did a very good job of managing Trump 1 and managing the pandemic. That's a long-winded answer, but that's what I've been trying to think about.
No, and for what it's worth, I don't know if it's long-winded or not, but I think we're thinking on similar lines here. I give the former prime minister high marks for pandemic era emergency responses. I give him poor marks for how he handled the end of it. It seemed like he was starting to miss it, politically speaking. But the early rollout was, I think, mixed bag, because we spent weeks sort of in the risk to Canada's low phase while Canadians were buying up every roll of toilet paper. But then eventually, when the government got engaged, they got engaged, and I think they handled the opening months well. Cannabis, you've mentioned, I think is good. I think history will regard that well. But I did read that same poll you did last week, and I thought it was fascinating to think 9 years in office, 2 major wars, 2 Donald Trump terms, a literal plague, the Emergencies Act being used, all of the conversations we've had about foreign interference and the integrity of our democracy. And the incredible thing about that poll you mentioned is that they also asked the same questions and they broke it down by partisan affiliation. And even Justin Trudeau's fans thought in 9 years of chaos, bloodshed, death, and upheaval, his signature achievement was legalized dope. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, it's not that I disagree with cannabis legalization. I agree with it. It was long past due. I'm glad it happened. But oh my God, this is where we put finite political capital. And on Friday of last week, the day Prime Minister Trudeau resigned and Prime Minister Carney was sworn in, my colleague Andrew Potter wrote for The Line a pretty scathing indictment of Justin Trudeau, and I thought it was the harshest one that I've read that is still fair, because there's a lot of deranged stuff going around. I don't think what Andrew wrote was deranged. I thought it was fair, but it was harsh. My own criticisms of Trudeau are probably not as harsh as Andrew's. But I was talking, Stephen, because I guess I'm a weirdo. I was talking about the Munich Conference, 1938. The Allies sell out Czechoslovakia to the Nazis, but then the British especially, they use that time. They built Hurricanes, they built Spitfires, they built ships. And I'm looking around, especially since COVID, since the convoy, since foreign interference, since the invasion of Ukraine. Did we build a Spitfire or whatever the modern version of that is? Like, what did Justin Trudeau use his extra time in office to do? I've even asked senior liberals this question, and they get really uncomfortable and shuffle their feet. And sooner or later, the conversation comes back around to cannabis.
I thought Jamie Saranac, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, had a good piece in the National Post last week, talking about how Trudeau seemed to miss the opportunity or the urgency of the moment after Russia invaded Ukraine. Although I think actually he deserves credit for steadfastly supporting Ukraine, and but it should have been clear then, if it wasn't before, that we needed to invest more in our national defense, which is not a natural thing for liberals to do. They tend to be the party of social programs, not national defense. But yeah, that looked like a missed opportunity. Almost all of his third term, it's hard to point at it and think of very much that he did that wasn't an NDP idea. And I could defend the pharmacare and dental programs. That they are very significant for people who need help, but they were NDP ideas and will be mostly appreciated by NDP voters.
If the Russians send a naval task force to the Arctic, are we going to throw subsidized insulin at them? And you said a minute ago that it's not a national defense isn't a natural priority for the liberals. Unfortunately, it is often not a particularly natural priority for the conservatives either. In this country, we've got a pretty
only recent prime minister with a worse record than Trudeau. Well, actually, both Chrétien and Harper.
Pretty bad.
I think are, and it's funny because in Harper's case, he seemed sort of warlike, but he didn't put up the money.
Speaking of which, and first of all, I agree with that. Many ex-Harper PMO guys will still gently rib me about some of the savage columns I was writing about them at the Post at the time. I want to talk about when you were writing the book, you were obviously talking to a lot of people around him, and I want to ask you a question about how decisions got made, because one of the really frustrating things for me, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, but also a little bit during the pandemic and also during the convoy as well, is that you would look at what the government was saying. And you mentioned sort of steadfast support for Ukraine. I don't know if any Western leader has said the right things as often and as well as Justin Trudeau did. Like, in his tone, his statements, his rhetoric, I thought, bang on point, no notes. Like, I would endorse everything he was saying. And then my eyes would slide over to the cabinet, which sat for almost 2 years on a plan to dramatically increase Canadian domestic ammunition production, which now we might want for our own purposes. But at the time, it was to support Ukraine. And I never was able to figure out how the guy can go out and say, before breakfast, Canada will always be with Ukraine. We must stand up for the rules-based international order. Russian aggression must not be tolerated. And then go to a cabinet meeting and punt for like the 100th consecutive week on the order to actually begin Canadian domestic munitions rearmament. Did you get a sense when you were talking with people to write your book about why rhetoric was often so far ahead of action? Like, where was the breakdown between thought and deed?
Okay, so there's a bit of a cliche about the Trudeau government is they think the announcement is the deliverable, right? They make the announcement. Have you been keeping track, by the way, of the 2 billion trees? Do you know whether?
Oh yeah.
I don't know what the count is at the moment, but
it's sub 2 billion.
Yes. So I think that it appears there was a problem. There was a very small group of I think effective people in the PMO, and unlike certainly the Chrétien government, which was able to do a greater number of things at one time, the Trudeau government seemed to be able to do a pretty good job of 2 or 3 things that were very important, and other things would be stuck in the inbox. So managing Trump, dealing with COVID, they could do that stuff. But by the time you get down to like item number 6 or item number 7, and I think it's a huge missed opportunity. I'll point to one of the last things Trudeau did, which was release a study on options for the future of the RCMP after 10 years. So one of the things that I was excited about when Trudeau was elected and made Ralph Goodale public safety minister, I thought, well, finally, maybe somebody will do something about contract policing, about the, long overdue reform of rural policing in Canada. And 10 years later, 9 years later, he leaves, adding another report to all the many other reports that say the government should get out of, the RCMP should get out of contract policing. So, and that's one of, I think the CBC and the Department of Defense, the Canadian Forces, and the RCMP, 3 vital national institutions, are all in worse shape than when he got there.
Because I hate myself, for my sins, over the years, I've written about Canadian rail travel and train infrastructure. And I was digging through my old columnist archive, and I found this great piece I wrote in 2016. Justin Trudeau had been prime minister less than a year, and Via Rail was announcing a shovel-ready project to dramatically expand faster, not truly high speed, but faster rail service along the Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal corridor. And it had a $4 billion budget and roughly a 4-year timeline. 9 years later, one of the last things these guys announced was a 5-year study of the same goddamn thing. And the budget allotted to the study was equal to or greater than the budget that Via said was necessary 9 years ago to do the thing. And you said a minute ago, like, the announcement is the plan, right? I think that's bang on. It's not only that the announcement was the plan, but was that these guys, meaning kind of the PMO and PMO adjacent people, they would not only would they announce things and expect the full benefit of the announcement as if it was complete. We have given the country high speed rail. We have reformed the RCMP. When you point out that it's just another announcement, they'd be shocked and hurt. In a very, and I never thought it was political cynicism. I think they were genuinely hurt that they weren't getting the credit for the things they announced that they were going to do.
Well, it's funny because in other things, like I thought one of the reasons why, since the time I started writing the book to now, my sense of the government's accomplishments has diminished, is that the carbon tax, which I think is an obviously superior policy to whatever is going to replace it, it became clear some time ago it was not going to survive this government. And it seems fairly obvious. I don't know if they could have saved it if they'd sold it properly, but they didn't sell it properly. So, it's funny that, like, in some ways, they're very good at communicating, and it's a top priority. And in other ways, I think that they struggle in a way that the Conservatives do not, to understand what's happening in comms where the rubber hits the road, right? How people absorb messages, where the public is, how to reach them, how to trigger the Pavlovian part of their brain and motivate them. But on the other hand, they're probably better at kind of higher level narrative building and elite communications.
One of the things I always thought was funny about these guys, particularly in recent years, when the prime minister was sort of in his will he or won't he stage, his poll numbers were collapsing. A lot of very smart liberals I would talk to would be like, our comms are terrible. Like, we really need to do a better job messaging what we've done to the Canadian people. If the Canadian people knew what we had done for them, if they knew what this prime minister had accomplished, he'd be more popular. And I'm just here to make friends, man. So I would nod and smile and listen politely. And then I'd think to myself, these people are nuts. Comms is not the problem. Over-promising and under-delivering is the problem. Like, to the extent that their comms is the problem, it's not the things that they say. It's the gap between what they've said and what they've done. And, I think one of my favorite ones in recent years, I was talking about this with my colleague Jen Gerson recently, is they keep announcing an ever longer list of firearms that they have banned, but they also keep further delaying the date that any of them will have to be actually surrendered to the government. And I told Jen that almost became sort of like a perfect little microcosm of how this government operated. In theory, an ever more impressive promise of accomplishment, but an ever further delayed timeline of when it would actually happen. And I remember a few times, particularly during foreign interference, I think that was kind of when this was really on full display, because we had the commission, we had documents, we had internal communications being revealed. Did you ever get the sense that these guys sort of forgot that they were the government? And they kind of kept being like, man, this government is so unresponsive. We can't get a damn thing done with these guys. Someone has got to do something about this. And it seems to me that they forgot that they were the government.
Foreign interference is one of two files where I remain confused by why they didn't listen to wise commentators like ourselves and take action sooner, because it was obvious. It was obvious that China, in particular, was that we had left ourselves vulnerable to exploitation by really ruthless people. And there was a point where you could say, well, nobody really saw that coming. And then there was a point where everyone had seen it coming. The other thing was the unplanned massive immigration, which I think, and that poll showed it is really what did what truly destroyed the Trudeau brand in the public mind. Was in the end, that's what tipped a lot of people over, including new Canadians. Right? It's not like just some old stock thing. No. People said this is getting out of hand. So those two files, it's like, uh, I hope that some other more successful reporter will eventually be able to figure out what the Liberals thought they were doing about those two things.
I think the problem might not be, Stephen, the quality of the reporter. The problem might be the implausibility of the answer, because I don't think there is a good answer. Sometimes smart people do stupid things, and they might not even be able to tell you later why. And I don't think they were actively trying to break anything, but I think maybe it's somewhere along the way their feedback loop got broken in a way that they became incapable of differentiating unfair partisan attack from urgently blinking warning light on national dashboard.
Yeah, it's funny. The day that the first question period after Pierre Poilievre became leader of the Conservative Party, he said he attacked Trudeau for basically a cheap shot for using the government airplane to travel to Europe for government business. But he said, "Why you're using the government airplane when you should be paying attention to the concerns of senior citizens in Atlantic Canada who are going to be struggling to pay for heating oil because of the carbon tax." And Trudeau laughed it off and said he was I forget exactly what he said, but just gave a typical partisan response. I'm not going to take any lessons from blah, blah, blah. Anyway, 6 months later, Trudeau's swallowing himself on the carbon tax and heating oil in Atlantic Canada. And you think, dude, you were not listening, right? Like, the leader of the opposition was doing his job and pointing out a real political vulnerability, and you didn't get it, right? So that said, a lot of the critiques that we're making of Trudeau are not, and this government are not unique to him. It's hard. Our jobs are easy in a way because we sit there and say, "What a bunch of dummies." But you could, if we were having this conversation at the end of the Harper government, we would have been able to say many of the same things about different files.
One of Trudeau's people sneered at me once. Must be easy to make criticisms up there in the cheap seats. And I told her, yes.
Yeah.
It sure is. It's great work if you can get it. I want to ask you one more question, and it relates a little bit to what we've been talking about already. I just want to reframe it a little bit. Last week on Friday, Andrew Potter, as I mentioned, a very blistering criticism of Justin Trudeau. On the weekend, from me, a more targeted one, still critical, but trying to kind of go, yeah, he had accomplishments, but here's where I think he really dropped the ball. I want to put a question to you, and I'm not asking you to carry any water for him here, but what do you think? Let's assume the Trump problems are transitory. Carney does an amazing job, or Pierre Poilievre does an amazing job. Let's pretend we are heading into a Canadian golden age. I don't think we are, but just, let's be optimists for a minute.
Mm.
What is the best case scenario legacy for Justin Trudeau? Like, in 50 years, you've mentioned university professors. 50 years from now, some young hotshot professor is writing about Justin Trudeau and finds themselves really impressed by him. What is the best case scenario for a Trudeau government?
I think he was a standard bearer for progressivism around the world. And he embodied Canada on the world stage. He must be the most famous Canadian, or right up there, right? Like, people around the world think of Canada, they think of Justin Trudeau. So people on the populist right think that that's terrible, but to a lot of other people, he's an attractive and progressive man from a country that whose values they like. He reflected, I think, values of certainly the progressive side of Canada, and the significant expansion of the social welfare state, beyond the point of, I think, now where we could really afford it, right? Because our productivity and budget is not what it should be. But that, for people who need help, particularly child poverty and that kind of thing, he did a lot for people who need help. I don't think that he has to apologize for any of that.
One of my friends wrote a column for The Line a couple of years ago where he made a point very similar to the one that you were making, which was that Justin Trudeau was at the tail edge of the era of Obama-style leaders in presentation, in rhetoric, and policy positions. And then what happened, of course, is that the world went weird. Like, we weren't on that West Wing trajectory we thought we were on. We were on a different trajectory. And I think we can fault Trudeau and his government for being slow to realize that and for failing. Not doing a bad job or an insufficient job. I think for failing to adjust our national trajectory to track with reality. But if you actually sort of extrapolate out where we thought we were going in 2015 and imagine where we would have thought we were 10 years later, Justin Trudeau is probably the perfect encapsulation of Canadian progressivism. And he got away with it for about 4 years. And then the bottom fell out and he never really seemed to figure out what to do.
Yeah, he was. And so that's a kind of progressivism where identity is very important, and acknowledging and trying to come to terms with historical injustice. And it was kind of impressive in a way, the way that he dealt with those issues. And then the menu shifted, and he didn't.
Yeah.
Right. So he as BLM and the Me Too movement, really dominated. I think, in retrospect, he was too much on the vanguard.
Yeah.
And someone like Chrétien, for example, would have found a way to have stayed culturally more in tune with where the country was, rather than where the avant-garde was, right? And I think that I believe that ultimately that helped to trigger a whole lot of people who you don't want to trigger. The convoy populists are intensely aggravated by attacks on the symbols of the country. I'm really struck by the research of the Australian sociologist Karen Stenner, where she's done very careful research on this, and it's triggering for people who have a predisposition to engage with authoritarian messages. I don't think that Trudeau and his people sort of anticipated the blowback that this was going to lead to. And I see it every day on social media. People say, well, I was a patriotic Canadian, but he betrayed my idea of the country. And, he's a human being, and his political instincts were a little out of whack, or he was just a little too dramatic. But that love of drama is what made him who he was in the first place. So I don't actually judge him that harshly. We are where we are. That's what happened.
Sometimes he saw opportunity where he should have seen warning and leaned into it. And yeah.
But you could say the same of Harper in the other way.
Oh, I would.
The War of 1812 stuff, and on resource development. We've got these pirates and these villains, environmentalists. We've got to destroy them before they destroy us. That stuff was. All of these people have to look after their own constituencies, and I think that people like us who don't have to worry about that at all can sometimes judge them a little harshly for feeding too much red meat to their bases.
Well, like I said to that liberal accuser of mine, It is great work. It is a lot of fun. Well, look, this has been fun. Thanks for joining me today, man. I hope you feel better. Stay off that ankle, but we're recording this on the Monday. We'll release it on the Tuesday. But right now, it is St. Patrick's Day. Have an amazing one. Honor that Irish ancestry. I'll do the same. Exactly. I hear you. Thanks, buddy. Have a great day. That was my conversation with Stephen Marr, author, journalist. His most recent book, The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau. Many thanks to him. Also, PJ Fournier, of course, from 338canada.com and 338canada.ca. Our website is readtheline.ca. Check us out there. We've got a whole bunch of new social media channels we would love it if you could become big fans of. And as always, like and subscribe. A warning, folks, based on the rumors we're hearing, our next episode of On the Line is likely going to be at the beginning of an election campaign. Can't promise you that yet, but that's looking likely. So buckle up, click that like button, click that subscribe button, and prepare yourselves emotionally. It looks like it's coming our way real soon.